This was where things began getting more menacing. That was the moment when the alarm bells started going off in my head. Suddenly, he has this sinister look on his face. He then starts closing the door behind us, and he begins locking it. He's then standing in front of the door, blocking our path to it. And he says, "So, would you boys like to play the real game?"
There is an unwritten code in Brooklyn. You don't tell anyone else's stories, and you don't talk about anyone else's business. Every story I tell is mine. Locations, names, and specific details have all been changed to honor that code. This is Brooklyn Files, the real stories.
When you're growing up in Brooklyn, life comes at you very fast. One day, you're hanging out, having a fun time with your friends. The next day, you're fending for your life, literally. People come and go, in and out of your life. Some die, some move, some get put away in prison. But because life comes at you so fast, you tend to sweep things under the rug. Things that may be a huge deal to other people, you tend to let roll off your back. It's just part of growing up in such a fast-moving, tough environment. And that's why I strongly believe that what happened to me likely happened to a lot of kids back in the 80s, especially that it was the kind of thing at the time that you didn't talk about in those days. And in fact, talking to many of my friends as an adult, you come to find that a lot of people had similar stories like mine when they were younger. This all began when we lived in this blue-collar, middle-class neighborhood in Brooklyn. It was 1983. I was 14 years old. There were so many kids that we hung out with on this street that we were always getting in some kind of trouble. We would do all kinds of mischievous things like play ring and run. We would get in fistfights. We would throw snowballs at city buses. We were rough kids. We did rough things. We would do this thing called skitching, where we would hold on to the back of a city bus while it was rolling by, and it would pull you in the snow. It was fun. It was dangerous. When 4th of July came around, we would buy firecrackers, and we would put them in dog crap and then light them, just to see if we could run fast enough before we got splattered. And some of the time we did, other times we didn't. It was kind of a dare game that we played. Sometimes I would go home with speckles of dog crap on the back of my sweatshirt or pants, and my mother, she would be absolutely furious. I mean, rightfully so. Who could blame her for having to clean up that kind of a mess? And all because we thought it was fun. It was fun for us, but not so fun for her. She had to clean it up. And we would also buy bottle rockets, and we would stick them in the end of a pipe or one of those wiffle ball bats. And we would use it like a rocket launcher and launch the bottle rocket like straight at each other out of the top. And we were just like aiming at each other like it was nothing. We also loved our video games, so if we weren't going to the arcade, we would stay home and play our home video console, and that was a lot of fun. We would stay inside, especially in the winter, and play for hours on end, and we'd play Space Invaders and Combat and Indy 500. Those were some of the earliest video game titles back in those days. And I had a really close friend that I was essentially attached at the hip with. His name was Robbie. Robbie and I did everything. Robbie's dad was considered the neighborhood dad. He was a single guy. He was a lower level guy on Wall Street, as I remember it. In the summer, he would pile us up in the car, take us to water parks. We'd go to amusement parks, and even his company picnic, he would take us to the lake to go swimming. He was a great guy. Robbie's dad was always looking out for us too, giving us all kinds of advice. And we spent a lot of time with Robbie's dad. He was just a really good father figure. Now, Robbie had a next door neighbor. His name was Richard. Richard was about 35 years old. He was single, lived by himself, worked for the sanitation department. And he was a really interesting guy in that he loved electronic gadgets. He also loved motorcycles, and he had one himself. So whenever Robbie and I would be outside his house hanging out, we would usually see Richard, his neighbor, and we would interact with him. sometimes Richard would be in his garage fiddling around with his latest gadget. I remember one time walking into Richard's garage and he was playing with an oscilloscope, that machine you use to measure electronic waves, and it has that little TV screen on it. He had lots of things like that in his garage. He was always fiddling with them, or he was washing his motorcycle in his driveway, or he'd be playing with his latest gadget in front of his house. Sometimes it was one of those remote control cars or a toy helicopter or what have you. I viewed Richard as kind of a big kid. It was almost as if he was a teenager, just like us, except with a full-time job and enough money to spend on all kinds of fun gadgets and things. All the kinds of things that I wished I could have, but couldn't afford at my age. Coming from a poor household, my mom couldn't buy me that stuff either, but he was always tinkering with these kinds of fun gadgets. As two 14-year-old boys, me and Robbie would always find Richard to be fascinating. Of course, being Robbie's neighbor, Richard would be very friendly with us, and we'd see him pretty frequently. He would invite us over to come play with his gadgets. We would spend a couple of hours hanging out with this guy. He would take us for rides on his motorcycle. He'd even offer to bring us to the amusement pier to play arcade games and go on rides. Now, up until that point, the biggest red flag that Richard showed was inviting us to his upstate New York cabin on a lake to spend the weekend. He wanted to take me and Robbie up to that cabin so that we could spend a weekend in the summer. And he asked us a few different times. And I eventually asked my mom, and she flat out said, "Are you crazy? There's no way I'm letting you go up to a stranger's cabin for a weekend. I don't know this guy, and that sounds weird." And it was around then that I remember hearing that one of our other friends, a kid that we hung out with once in a while, we would play sports with this kid, but we didn't hang out with him on a regular basis. His name was Bucky, that was his nickname. And at some point, I heard that Bucky went up to Richard's cabin on the lake a couple of times. And I remember in that moment being a little jealous because it sounded like they had a lot of fun. And I heard about Bucky riding Richard's dirt bike at the lake and how they would go fishing and swimming. And me and Robbie just thought that Richard was this fun-loving, adventurous guy. Now, keep in mind, as teenagers, we didn't find this to be strange at all. We found Richard to be intriguing. He acted like one of us. And he was just this big kid to us. He was fun, he was welcoming, but even though we saw nothing wrong with him, our parents saw it a much different way. In fact, Robbie's dad would always say to Robbie, "I don't want you hanging out with Richard." Even my mother would always say on a pretty regular basis, whenever Richard's name would come up at the dinner table, she would say, "I don't want you hanging out with that guy." And it got to the point where my mother even told my grandmother that we were hanging out with him against her will. And even my grandmother started telling us. Whenever we would see her, she'd say something to the effect of, "Your mother tells me you're hanging out with this weird guy. I don't want you spending time with him. He sounds very strange." And I don't think we could fully understand why that was a problem to our parents, but it was. As 14-year-olds, you know how it goes. We would ignore our parents, we would sneak around, and we would still end up hanging out with Richard against their will. We didn't see any danger in doing so we just kept doing it. We would go in Richard's house and he would play popular movies on his VCR. Now that was another thing. At the time, a VCR was a very modern piece of technology. That year in 1983, only around 10% of American households had a VCR. So we certainly didn't have one at my house. So that was another thing that I found to be a source of intrigue, to think that somebody could watch a full-length feature in their home, which at the time was a very new concept, something I'd wish I had access to, but I didn't, and Richard did. So that was another thing that would lure me over there. Among the many things that we did when we hung out with Richard, he would break out the VCR tapes and we would watch full-length features like Jaws and Star Wars, and he'd put those movies on and offer us a seat on the couch, maybe some iced tea, maybe some popcorn. Of course, Richard, being into his gadgets, had one of those home video game consoles. He would invite us upstairs to a spare room where he had this console connected to a television. This was where things began getting more menacing, if you will. One day, we go upstairs to his room where the video game was. I remember thinking how strange it was that one of the video game cartridges that he had, it was a bootleg game cartridge. It wasn't one of those name brand titles that I was used to playing. Now you gotta know I had the same video game console at home myself, and I was pretty well versed at the time on all the various game titles that were available for this console. The name of this game title was that of an explicit act. I remember thinking, I don't remember that being a video game title that I've ever seen before. And the box looked all bootlegged. I was kind of perplexed by that. It threw me off. On the screen was this very act being done in the video game. He asked me and Robbie if we wanted to play the game. That was the moment when the alarm bells started going off in my head. Just as I was about to turn around and say no thank you, I see Richard, this guy that was always friendly and bubbly with us. Suddenly, he has this sinister look on his face, as if he's possessed, like he was up to no good. He then starts closing the door behind us, and he begins locking it. He's then standing in front of the door, blocking our path to it. We're in this upstairs spare room in Richard's home. After locking the door, he's standing in front of it as if to block our path from getting out of the room. My friend Robbie and I, we freeze up and we're not sure what to say. It started to feel like he was trying to trap us there in the room, as if daring us to get past him to get out the door. I remember my adrenaline level immediately spiking. My heart began racing like all of a sudden I got this fight or flight response. Richard then starts walking towards me and my friend, and he says, "So, would you boys like to play the real game?" And he does that thing with his eyebrows like that. And he clearly is talking about the act that was taking place on the video game. Now don't forget, we're like pretty rough kids, and we were very able to handle ourselves, or at least we thought so. Right then, I think I said something like, "Hey man, you better open that door fast or I'm gonna beat the shit out of you." But I remember thinking to myself how my mom and Robbie's dad over and over always tried to warn us about this guy and how we just refused to listen, and we kind of put ourselves in this situation. I'm thinking how we should have listened to our parents. And keep in mind, Richard wasn't this very big guy. I think he was only about 5'8". He was a bit stocky, but not a large man overall. Right at that moment, I pushed past him. I bump him out of the way. He smashes into the wall. I then grab the door handle and unlock the lock. And Robbie started to follow me as I threw the door open, and we both went through it. As we're running down the stairs now, Richard is yelling, "I was only kidding, I was only kidding." And something like, "Why are you guys running?" And we began to slow down when we got to the bottom of the stairs, and I looked up and he's just laughing at us. And we didn't know what to make of it. To this day, I still have a recurring dream, by the way, that I'm like running down these stairs and he's chasing me. But I remember being a little freaked out, and I thought to myself, was he really kidding, or was he hoping that we would go along with his demented idea? My instincts were telling me that he was serious, but he was probably scared by our reaction. Either way, we were too freaked out to stay inside this guy's house after what had just happened. So as soon as me and Robbie, we get outside of Richard's house, we start walking around the block, we go down the alley, we just start like walking around the neighborhood, and we begin talking about what we should do. And I remember Robbie saying something like, "I don't think I should tell my dad what happened, because if he finds out, he's gonna kill that son of a bitch." As an adult looking back, I realized we probably should have told somebody, because as a 14-year-old, you really don't think of something like that as being a repetitive behavior. You tend to think that it's only a one-off, like something that only happened to you. I think we started to rationalize not telling anyone, just keeping it to ourselves. And I remember the both of us agreeing at the time that we would just keep it a secret between the two of us. And that was it. It would just die with us. After all, our parents did tell us to stay away from that guy, and we were sneaking around behind their backs, and we were both afraid that we would get in some kind of trouble if we told anybody that we'd still been around that guy after being warned many, many times on numerous occasions. I mean, he didn't actually do anything to us. He just locked the door and asked us if we wanted to play that game. And that was kind of how we rationalized it and made it not that big of a deal in the moment. and kept it to ourselves from that day forward. Now fast forward to about 3 months later, we're out in the street in front of Robbie's house, and we're playing a game of stickball with a few of our other friends. By this time, we made it a point to never go into Richard's house again. We'd never entered it. We pretty much kept our distance from him from that point forward. And as we're out there in the street just playing our game of stickball, we suddenly see what appears to be numerous NYPD detectives. They're walking up the stairs of Richard's house. On top of that, we start to notice a couple of other marked patrol cars. Now they begin rolling up outside the house. No lights, no sirens, just quietly. We weren't exactly sure what this was all about, but me and Robbie were starting to think that we did have some idea. Me, Robbie, and a few of our other friends were playing stickball in the middle of the street. Suddenly there's this big commotion happening in front of Richard's house. Police are walking up his stairs. Police cars are pulling up to his house. We begin watching the house to see what was happening. And I remember wondering at the time if this had something to do with what Robbie and I had experienced at Richard's house. It was in the back of my mind. And Robbie even said something to me like, "Do you think they finally found out about what he's been doing?" At the time, we had no way of knowing there was any kind of history with this guy. As far as I was concerned, that was a one-time thing, as I said, that he tried with us. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I guess I did wonder. Minutes after the police had disappeared inside Richard's house, we eventually see him come out in handcuffs, and he isn't looking at anyone. He's just being led down the stairs by the police, and he's looking straight down as if he didn't want to make eye contact with anyone. By now, there's a bunch of neighbors outside as well, and they're all gawking. Everyone's watching this house, and it's becoming this like spectacle on our street. You could hear a lot of chattering among the neighbors, and it didn't seem like anyone really knew what was going on. But around 3 or 4 days later, the word started trickling out and spreading around the neighborhood. Supposedly, someone had seen it in the newspaper that Richard was arrested and charged with several felonies, some very serious crimes. One of the charges was classified as a violent felony. He was also charged with kidnapping in the second degree, which is a Class B felony. Altogether, he was facing 32 years in the state penitentiary. Ultimately, Richard was convicted and sentenced to 22 years in a prison in upstate New York. Apparently, when Richard was traveling up to his lake house in upstate New York, like we had heard, he was bringing Bucky up there on those weekend trips. They would go dirt biking, fishing, and do other activities, but apparently there was much more going on than we could have ever imagined. Supposedly this poor kid had been brought up there, was spending entire weekends at this cabin. We don't really know the specific details of what was taking place. I'm not sure why his mom allowed her son to go up there to his cabin, but somehow I'm sure she regretted her decision for the rest of her life. It made me more appreciative of my mom's discernment and how adamant she had been about not letting us go up to that cabin at the time when I asked her. At first, I was jealous of Bucky when I found out he was allowed to go up there. To a 14-year-old, that just sounded like so much fun. But after I knew what I knew, I ended up feeling sorry for the poor kid. I really did. But his mom clearly didn't see what my mom did, and that was very unfortunate. My mother ultimately saved me from the terrible fate that Bucky had to endure. I don't know where Bucky is today. I never stayed in touch with him. Like I said, I never really knew him that well. We just played sports with him occasionally. But wherever he is, I'm sure he regrets going to that lake to this day. Apparently, Richard's family ended up selling his home, and some new people moved in shortly thereafter on the block. As for my friend Robbie, years later, I found out that Richard was trying to manipulate him even more aggressively whenever I wasn't around and when Robbie was alone. I never found out if anything substantial ever did happen to Robbie in that sense. Perhaps something did and it was kept under wraps. After all, Robbie was afraid to tell his dad anything out of fear of getting in trouble, but I always hoped nothing did happen. As for Robbie's dad, I got word a few years ago that he passed away, and that was sad. Robbie and I, we never stayed in touch, but I still think about him to this day.